I never expected that a failed generator would be the thing to dismantle the life I had so carefully constructed. My life was a fortress of solitude, built from quiet routines and predictable days. I was a graphic designer, a job that allowed me to exist primarily through a screen, translating the messy chaos of client demands into clean, orderly lines. My apartment in the city was a minimalist sanctuary, every object in its designated place, a physical manifestation of the control I exerted over my own small world. The walls I had built around myself were high, not out of malice, but out of fear. A deep, quiet fear of the messiness of other people, of the unpredictable currents of emotion that could sweep you away if you weren't properly anchored. For 3 months, I had been renting a small, modernist cabin nestled in the woods, a temporary escape from the city's hum that had started to feel more like a scream. It was my self-prescribed work retreat, a place to finish a major project in peace. And it was peaceful. But the most significant feature of the landscape wasn't the towering pines or the crisp mountain air. It was him. Elias. He owned the property. He lived in the main house, a larger, more rustic structure of dark wood and wide windows, set a few hundred yards away from my rental, just visible through a curtain of birch trees. He was the architect of my quiet admiration, the centerpiece of a museum I visited only in my mind. He was tall, with shoulders that seemed built to carry the weight of the sky. His presence was a stark contrast to my own digital existence. He was utterly, irrevocably physical. I watched him from my picture window as if he were a rare species of wildlife, something to be observed from a safe and respectful distance. I saw him chop wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady, grounding heartbeat in the forest silence. I saw him work on the engine of his old pickup truck, his brow furrowed in concentration, a smear of grease on his cheek that I found inexplicably endearing. He moved with a kind of deliberate economy, no wasted motion, every action imbued with a quiet confidence that I could only dream of possessing. He was a man made of sawdust and pine sap, of engine oil and earth. Our interactions were brief, transactional, and excruciating for me. He would stop by to make sure the plumbing was working, or to drop off a fresh supply of firewood for the stove. In those moments, my carefully ordered world would tilt on its axis. He would fill the small space of my cabin with his sheer size, with a scent of cedar and something else, something uniquely his, a clean, masculine smell like fresh laundry dried in the cold mountain air. His voice was a low rumble, a pleasant vibration that seemed to settle deep in my bones. I would answer his polite questions with clipped, awkward responses, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He was, in my mind, a monument to a type of masculinity that was entirely foreign to me. And he was, I was certain, completely and utterly unattainable. There was the professional barrier, of course, he was my landlord. But the larger wall, the insurmountable one, was the one I had constructed from my own assumptions. I had seen a woman with him once, early in my stay. She had helped him unload groceries from his truck, laughing at something he said. I never saw her again, but the image was seared into my brain. It became the cornerstone of my certainty. He existed in a world of wives and girlfriends, of a straightforward, heterosexual life that had no room for the quiet, yearning gaze of the man in the rental cabin. So I kept my distance. I curated my admiration like a collection of priceless, fragile artifacts. I cataloged the way the morning light caught the silver strands in his dark hair. I memorized the sound of his low laugh carrying on the wind from the main house. I hoarded these small, stolen observations, polishing them in the quiet of my lonely evenings. It was a pathetic sort of comfort, admiring a piece of art you knew you could never touch, let alone own. It was safe. He was a beautiful, distant star, and I was content to be an anonymous astronomer, charting his orbit from my isolated observatory. The ache of it was a familiar companion, a dull throb of loneliness that had become so constant I barely noticed it anymore. It was simply the background noise of my life, the price of admission for my fortress of solitude, and I had always been willing to pay it. The storm arrived without fanfare, a subtle darkening of the afternoon sky that quickly bled into an oppressive, slate-gray ceiling. The first snowflakes were fat and lazy, drifting down like silent apologies. Then, the wind began to howl. Within an hour, The world outside my window had dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The orderly lines of the forest, the comforting distance between my cabin and his house, all of it was erased by the blizzard's furious hand. My structured retreat had become a cage. I wasn't worried at first. I had food, water, and a formidable stack of firewood. The power flickered once, twice, then held steady. I put on some music, lit the wood stove, and tried to see the storm as an atmospheric enhancement to my solitude, a dramatic backdrop for my focused work. But the fortress I had built was more fragile than I knew. Around 9 o'clock that evening, the lights didn't just flicker. They died. They went out with a soft, final sigh, plunging the cabin into a profound and sudden darkness, broken only by the flickering, demonic light of the fire in the stove. The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness. The hum of the refrigerator, the low thrum of the heating system, the quiet charge of my laptop. All the small, electric reassurances of modern life were gone. All I could hear was the frantic, shrieking wind and the frantic, hammering beat of my own heart. And then, a new silence. The generator. The backup generator I had been told would kick in automatically had failed to do so. I was truly cut off. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of my composure. I fumbled for my phone, its screen a blinding beacon in the dark. No service. Of course. The cold, which had been held at bay by the electric heat, began to seep in through the floorboards, a creeping, insidious presence. The fire in the stove would keep me from freezing, but the cabin was designed for modern comforts, not for rugged survival. Its large, single-pane windows were bleeding warmth into the storm. I spent an hour feeding the fire, wrapped in every blanket I could find, telling myself it would be fine. The storm would pass. The power would return. But the temperature inside the cabin continued to drop, and the wind sounded like a living thing, a predator trying to claw its way inside. The thought of Elias's house, that sturdy structure of wood and stone, flickered in my mind. It looked so permanent, so capable of weathering a storm like this. I imagined him inside, warm and secure, completely unaware of my predicament. Just as I was resigning myself to a miserable, sleepless night huddled by the dwindling fire, a light appeared through the swirling snow. A single, powerful beam, cutting through the blizzard. It moved slowly, deliberately, bobbing and weaving its way toward my cabin. My heart leaped into my throat. It was him. It had to be him. A few minutes later, a heavy pounding rattled the door. I scrambled to unlatch it, my fingers clumsy with cold and anxiety. The door swung open, and he stood there, a titan framed against the white chaos. He was covered in snow, his hair and shoulders dusted with it, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He held a heavy-duty flashlight, its beam illuminating the concern etched on his face. "Leo," he said, his rumbling voice cutting through the wind's shriek. "I saw your lights go out. Is your generator not working?" I could only nod, my throat tight. I was shivering, though I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from his sudden, overwhelming presence. He stepped inside, bringing a gust of wind and snow with him, and the entire atmosphere of the cabin shifted. The space felt impossibly small, charged with his energy. He shone the flashlight around the dark, cold room, his gaze landing on the pathetic fire in the stove. "This won't last you the night," he stated, a simple fact devoid of judgment. "The power grid is down for the whole county. They're saying it could be a day, maybe two, before they can get to the lines up here." My stomach plummeted. 2 days. He turned his gaze back to me, his expression softening slightly. "You can't stay here. It's not safe. The main house has a wood-fired boiler and a better generator. You'll need to come stay with me." It wasn't a question. It was a command born of simple, practical necessity. My mind raced, searching for an excuse, an alternative. But there was none. My fortress had been breached. The carefully maintained distance between us was about to be annihilated by a force of nature. I had no choice but to nod again, a mute surrender. "Okay," he said, his voice calm and reassuring, a lighthouse in my sea of panic. "Grab a bag with whatever you need for a couple of days. I'll wait." He had shattered my solitude. He had broken through my walls. And as I numbly packed a bag in the stark beam of his flashlight, a terrifying, exhilarating thought echoed in the back of my mind. I was being rescued. and I was being led directly into the heart of the one place I had tried so desperately to keep at a distance. The walk to the main house was a disorienting battle against the elements. The snow was knee-deep, and the wind tore at us, trying to rip the breath from my lungs. Elias walked ahead of me, a dark, solid shape carving a path through the white chaos. I followed in his footsteps, my eyes fixed on his broad back, using him as a shield against the storm's fury. The beam of his flashlight cut a tunnel through the blizzard, and for those few minutes, he was my entire world, the only fixed point in a universe that had come undone. Stepping into his house was like entering another reality. The air was warm, thick with the scent of wood smoke, coffee, and something else, that clean, personal scent of his, now magnified, inescapable. The chaos of the storm was immediately muted, replaced by the crackle of a large fire in a stone hearth and the low, steady hum of a generator. My frozen limbs began to ache as warmth seeped back into them. His house was nothing like my minimalist cabin. It was lived in, comfortable, and unapologetically masculine. Blueprints were spread across a massive oak dining table. Well-worn books were stacked on every available surface. A half-finished woodworking project, a beautifully carved chair, sat in a corner, surrounded by a light dusting of sawdust. It was his space, a complete reflection of the man I had only observed from afar. I felt like an intruder, a ghost haunting the edges of his life. "You can put your bag in the guest room," he said, shaking the snow from his coat. "It's just up the stairs, first door on the left." His voice was practical, but I could see a flicker of something in his eyes. Awkwardness, maybe? He was navigating this strange, new territory, too. I did as he said, climbing the solid wooden stairs and finding a simple, comfortable room. When I came back down, he was in the kitchen, pouring steaming water into 2 mugs. He handed one to me. Hot chocolate. The gesture was so unexpectedly domestic, so kind, that it threw me completely off balance. "Thanks," I mumbled, my fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic. The simple touch of the mug, the heat radiating from it, was a profound comfort. Our fingers brushed as I took it from him, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt straight through my system. It was nothing, a meaningless accident, but in the hyper-aware state I was in, it felt like a brand. We sat on the large leather sofa in front of the fire, a chasm of space between us. The silence was thick, filled with the unspoken reality of our situation. We were 2 relative strangers, forced into an intimacy neither of us had chosen. I stared into the fire, watching the flames dance, hyper-aware of his every movement, every breath. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the cushions. I could hear the soft rustle of his flannel shirt as he shifted his weight. My senses were on high alert, cataloging every detail, storing it away in my mental museum. Only now the exhibits were alive and breathing just a few feet away. "Sorry about all this," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the sofa. "The generator in the cabin is usually reliable. The cold must have gotten to it." "It's not your fault," I said, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "Thank you for this. For getting me." He just nodded, taking a sip of his drink. We lapsed back into silence. This was so much worse than my secret observations. Then, I was in control, the unseen observer. Here I was seen. I was a participant in the scene, and I had no idea what my lines were. My usual social anxiety, normally a low hum, was now a roaring inferno. I focused on the sensory details to keep from spiraling. The scent of melting snow on his boots. The way the firelight carved shadows and highlights onto the rugged planes of his face. The quiet, steady rhythm of his breathing. Later, he made dinner. A simple stew, but it was hearty and delicious. We ate at the big oak table, the blueprints pushed to one side. The conversation was stilted, a series of questions and answers about my design work, about his carpentry. It was a careful dance around the edges of our lives, avoiding anything too personal. And yet, with every shared glance, with every small, polite gesture, the professional boundary between us was dissolving. He wasn't just my landlord anymore. He was the man who had pulled me from a storm, who had made me hot chocolate, who was now sharing a meal with me in the warm bubble of his home while the world raged outside. After dinner, we went back to the sofa. The awkwardness had eased slightly, replaced by a comfortable, if still tense, quiet. The wine we'd had with dinner had softened the sharp edges of my anxiety. He had put on some music, a quiet, instrumental album that filled the space without demanding attention. He stared into the fire for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "This house gets quiet," he said, not looking at me. "Too quiet sometimes." I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. My ex-wife, Sarah, she left about 2 years ago," he continued, his gaze still fixed on the flames. "We built this place together. Drew up the plans right here on this table. She loved the woods. Or I thought she did. Turns out she just loved the idea of the woods. The reality was too quiet for her. Too isolated." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Funny, huh? The very thing she hated is what I love most about it." He finally turned to look at me, and in his eyes, I saw a flicker of the same deep, profound loneliness that lived inside of me. The confident, capable facade had cracked, and for a moment, I saw the man underneath. A man who knew the ache of an empty house, the weight of a silence that was once filled with another person's presence. "I'm sorry," I said, the words feeling hopelessly inadequate. He just shook his head, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. "It's fine. It was a long time ago. But sometimes, like on a night like this, the quiet gets loud." In that moment, my feelings for him shifted. The distant, artistic admiration I'd held for him collapsed, replaced by a sudden, fierce wave of empathy. He wasn't a monument. He wasn't a star in a distant galaxy. He was just a man. A lonely man, just like me. And that realization was infinitely more dangerous than any simple crush could ever be. It made him real. It made the chasm between us feel, for the first time, like something that could possibly be crossed. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The hours bled into one another, marked only by Elias adding another log to the fire. The wine, the warmth, and the emotional weight of his confession had left me feeling heavy and sleepy, yet my mind was buzzing. The world had shrunk to the confines of this room, to the space between me and this man who had just shown me a piece of his vulnerable heart. "There's a hot tub on the back porch," Elias said suddenly, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. "It's wood-fired, so it's still working. Helps with the chill." He looked at me, a question in his eyes. "If you're interested." My first instinct was to say no. The idea was terrifying. It was too intimate, too exposed. It was a step into a territory from which there would be no retreat. But his earlier vulnerability had disarmed me, and another, braver part of me, a part that was tired of the fortress, tired of the fear, wanted to say yes. "Okay," I heard myself say, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. The back porch was covered, but the wind still whipped snow in from the sides, the flakes hissing as they hit the hot surface of the stovepipe connected to the tub. The tub itself was a large, cedar barrel, steam rising from it in thick, ghostly clouds. The air was bitingly cold, and we undressed quickly, a silent, unspoken agreement to not look at each other. I wrapped a towel around my waist, my skin prickling in the frigid air, and slipped into the water. The heat was a shock, a blissful, all-encompassing embrace that chased the last of the chill from my bones. I sank down to my neck, the water a comforting weight around me. Elias got in on the other side, the water sloshing and rising with his entry. He was a dark silhouette against the swirling snow, his broad shoulders and the strong column of his neck just visible in the dim light from the house. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the bubbling of the water, the crackle of the fire in the tub stove, and the ceaseless howl of the wind. The steam created a curtain between us, a private, liminal world suspended between the warmth of the water and the fury of the storm. The tension was palpable, a third presence in the tub with us. It was in the way we carefully avoided letting our feet touch, the way we kept our gazes fixed on the storm outside. "Better than huddling by the stove, right?" he said, his voice a low murmur. "Much better," I agreed, my own voice tight. My mind was a chaotic mess of sensation and fear. The scent of wet cedar and wood smoke. The feeling of the hot water against my skin. The sight of the snowflakes melting as they touched the surface of the water. And him, the knowledge of him, sitting just a few feet away, his body submerged in the same water as mine. It was an intimacy so profound it felt like it was rewriting my DNA. He shifted, the water swirling around me. I held my breath. He moved from his side of the tub, not with a sudden lurch, but with a slow, deliberate grace. The steam swirled, and for a second, he was obscured. Then, he was in front of me. Close. So close I could feel the heat radiating from his chest through the water. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. This is it, I thought. He's going to say something, tell me to move, something. But he didn't speak. He looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable in the faint light. And then he moved again. He lifted himself slightly, and then he settled his weight down, not next to me, not beside me, but directly onto my lap, his legs on either side of mine. The world stopped. Time, breath, thought, it all ceased to exist. There was only the solid, impossible weight of him. The feeling of his wet skin against my chest, the rough texture of the hair there. The water displaced by his body, sloshing up to my chin. My entire universe contracted to this single, shocking point of contact. My mind was a blank slate, wiped clean by disbelief. He was on my lap. Elias. He had crossed the chasm in a single, unbelievable movement. I was frozen, my hands floating uselessly at my sides in the water. I didn't know what to do, what this meant. Was this a mistake? A misunderstanding? But there was no misunderstanding the deliberate way he had positioned himself, facing me, his body settled against mine. My panic was a cold stone in my stomach, but beneath it, a slow, molten heat was spreading through my veins. He watched my face, his expression searching. He was waiting, giving me a chance to push him away, to object, to retreat back to my fortress. But the walls of that fortress were already rubble. The storm had knocked them down, and this man, this incredible, impossible man, was standing in the ruins, waiting for a signal. Slowly, tentatively, as if my arms were moving through thick molasses, I lifted my hands from the water. They trembled as I brought them up to his waist, resting them on the solid warmth of his hips. The skin there was slick and hot. The moment my fingers made contact, I felt a shudder go through him, a subtle, almost imperceptible reaction. It was an answer. He leaned in, closing the final few inches between us. His lips met mine. The kiss was not hard or demanding. It was soft, questioning, tentative. It tasted of chlorine from the water and something else, something uniquely Elias. It was a question, and I answered by kissing him back, my trembling hands tightening their grip on his hips. The kiss deepened, the initial uncertainty melting away, replaced by a slow, burning certainty. It was a kiss that spoke of shared loneliness, of long-held admiration, of a storm that had broken down every barrier and left only this raw, undeniable truth in its wake. My ordered, predictable life was over. It had ended here, in the heart of a blizzard, with the weight of this beautiful, impossible man in my lap. The morning after was brutally quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. The sky was a sharp, piercing blue, and the sun, a stranger after the long gray siege, cast a blinding glare off the pristine, untouched snow. The silence was absolute, the kind that follows a great and terrible noise. The wind was gone. The world was holding its breath. And so was I. I had woken up in the guest bed, alone. I had no memory of how I got there. The last thing I remembered clearly was that kiss in the hot tub, a moment that felt more like a dream, a feverish hallucination born of cold and wine and loneliness. We had come inside, wrapped in towels, avoiding each other's eyes. A quiet, mumbled goodnight was exchanged in the hallway, and then I was in my room, my heart still pounding a frantic, chaotic rhythm against my ribs. Now, in the harsh light of day, that dream felt like a transgression, a terrible, wonderful mistake. I went downstairs, my footsteps creaking on the wooden stairs, each sound an indictment. Elias was in the kitchen, a mug of coffee in his hands, staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape. He was already dressed in jeans and a thick sweater, back in his armor of capable landlord. He looked solid, grounded, and a million miles away. "Morning," he said, without turning around. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth it had held last night. "Power's back on." My heart sank. The magic, the strange intimacy of the storm, had been severed by the return of electricity. The world was being set right again, and with it, the proper distance between us was being reestablished. "Oh, good," I managed to say, my voice a croak. He turned then, but he didn't meet my eyes. He gestured with his mug toward the coffee pot. There's coffee. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, with the memory of what had happened. It was a suffocating, awkward silence that was 1,000 times worse than the comfortable quiet of the night before. I poured myself a coffee, my hands shaking slightly. Every move I made felt clumsy and loud. I was an alien in his space again, the temporary truce of the storm officially over. My mind, my greatest tormentor, went into overdrive. The anxiety spiral began. He regretted it. Of course, he regretted it. It was a fluke, a moment of weakness brought on by the storm and his own admission of loneliness. He was probably straight, and I had been a convenient, warm body. Or worse, he felt sorry for me, the pathetic, shivering man from the cabin. He was probably disgusted with himself. Disgusted with me. I had misread everything. I had taken his kindness, his vulnerability, and twisted it into something it wasn't. I had ruined the simple, safe dynamic we had. Now, I couldn't even go back to being his anonymous admirer. I had made myself known, and I had been found wanting. He started pulling on his heavy winter boots. I'm going to go clear a path to your cabin and see if I can get that generator started, just in case. His tone was all business. He was fixing the problem. I was the problem. He was restoring order. You don't have to, I said quickly. I can. I'm fine. It's my job, he said, his voice clipped. He still wouldn't look at me. That was it. That was the confirmation. He was retreating back into his role as landlord, putting the professional wall back up, brick by painful brick. I watched him go outside, the door closing with a solid, final thud. Through the kitchen window, I saw him grab a shovel and begin the arduous task of clearing a path, his movements powerful and efficient, his back turned to the house. Turned to me. The emotional chasm between us felt wider and more impassable than the deepest snowdrift. I had been given a glimpse of a different world, a world of warmth and connection, and then the door had been slammed shut in my face. The pain of it was a sharp, physical ache in my chest. My fortress was gone, and I was left standing in the ruins, exposed and freezing in the bright, unforgiving light of morning. I spent the next hour in a state of suspended agony, nursing my coffee and my bruised heart. I listened to the rhythmic scrape of Elias's shovel against the walkway, each sound a reminder of the growing distance between us. My anxiety had built a compelling case against me, and I was judge, jury, and executioner. The verdict was guilty. Guilty of hoping. Guilty of wanting. Guilty of taking a moment of shared humanity and daring to believe it could be something more. I decided I had to leave. Not just his house, but the cabin. The project could be finished from the city. I couldn't stay here now, not with the ghost of that kiss hanging between us, not with this thick, unbearable awkwardness poisoning the air. I would pack my things, thank him politely for his help during the storm, and flee back to my sterile apartment where the walls were solid, and the only person I could disappoint was myself. I went upstairs and started throwing my clothes into my bag, my movements jerky and frantic. It was a retreat, a full-scale, disorganized flight from the battlefield. I had ventured out from behind my walls, and I had been immediately wounded. The lesson was clear: stay inside. Stay safe. Stay alone. When I came back downstairs, my bag in hand, he was standing in the kitchen, stamping the snow from his boots. He had finished clearing the path. He finally looked up and saw the bag in my hand. For the first time all morning, his eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of something I couldn't name. Surprise? Panic. You're leaving? He asked, his voice low. I think it's for the best, I said, trying to keep my own voice steady, trying to sound casual, as if this were a normal departure. The project. I can finish it from home. Thanks again for everything. I started to move toward the door, needing to escape before I completely fell apart. Leo, his voice stopped me. It wasn't flat or businesslike anymore. It was tight, strained. Wait. I stopped, my back to him, my hand on the doorknob. I couldn't turn around. I braced myself for what was coming next. The apology. The last night was a mistake speech. The gentle but firm rejection that would shatter the last fragile pieces of my composure. We need to talk about last night. There it was. The 6 words I had been dreading. I squeezed my eyes shut, my knuckles white on the doorknob. Slowly, I turned to face him. He had taken a step closer. The kitchen, which had felt so large and empty, suddenly felt small and crowded again. There's nothing to talk about, I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. It was the storm. It was weird. Let's just forget it. I can't forget it, he said, his voice quiet but intense. And I don't think it was the storm. He took another step. He was so close now I could smell the cold, fresh air clinging to his clothes. I've been wanting to kiss you for 2 months, Leo. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, my mind refusing to process what I had just heard. It didn't compute. It was a system error. It didn't fit with the narrative my anxiety had so carefully constructed. What? I whispered. I saw you, he said, his eyes searching my face, pleading for me to understand. From my window, I saw you watching me. At first I thought. I don't know what I thought. But then I started watching you back. The way you work at your desk for hours. The way you walk in the woods. I wanted to talk to you, to actually talk to you, but I didn't know how. You seemed so self-contained. And I figured you were just here to work and be left alone. My carefully built case was crumbling, brick by brick. The generator, he continued, a faint flush rising on his cheeks. It wasn't completely broken. The cold stalled it, but I could have fixed it. Easily. I used the storm. I used it as an excuse to get you over here, because I'm a coward and I didn't know any other way to break through that distance you keep around you. The revelation was dizzying. The inciting incident, the catalyst for everything, hadn't been an act of God. It had been an act of Elias. He had engineered it. The forced proximity wasn't forced at all. It was a choice. His choice. But, the woman, I stammered, my brain grasping for the cornerstone of my assumptions. I saw you with a woman. A look of confusion crossed his face, then cleared. My sister? She came up to visit back in September. She lives 3 states away. He let out a soft, wry laugh. God, is that what this was about? You thought I was straight. I could only nod, feeling foolish and small. People usually do, he said with a shrug. I live alone in the woods and build things. It's a stereotype, but it's not me. The floodgates broke. All the fear, the yearning, the certainty of his unattainability, it all came pouring out of me. I've been watching you since the day I got here. I confessed, the words a torrent of relief. I thought you were the most incredible person I'd ever seen. But I was so sure you were, that I could never. I just built this whole story in my head. A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. So did I, he said softly. He closed the remaining space between us, and his hands came up to cup my face, his thumbs gently stroking my cheeks. His hands were warm and calloused, real and solid. Leo, he murmured, his eyes holding mine. Last night was the least weird thing that's happened to me in years. It was the most real. And then he kissed me again. This kiss was nothing like the tentative, questioning one in the hot tub. This was a kiss in the bright, clear light of day. It was sure and deep and full of all the words we hadn't known how to say. It tasted of coffee and cold air and the breathtaking, staggering relief of being utterly, completely wrong. It was a kiss that didn't feel like a transgression or a mistake. It felt like coming home. I didn't leave. My bag remained by the door for the rest of the day, a forgotten relic of a panic that already felt like it belonged to another lifetime. I didn't go back to the cabin. I stayed in the main house. I stayed with Elias. Those first few days were a delicate, tentative dance. We were navigating a new dynamic, mapping out the territory of us that had sprung up so suddenly in the space between landlord and tenant. We existed in the bubble created by the snow, the roads still unplowed, the rest of the world held at bay. It was our own private island, a quiet space to figure out what we were becoming. We cooked together in his warm, spacious kitchen, bumping hips and shoulders, our movements no longer accidental but intentional, exploratory. He showed me how to properly sharpen a kitchen knife, his large, warm hand covering mine as he guided the blade across the stone. The simple, instructional touch was more intimate than any kiss. I showed him the design project I was working on, spreading my laptop open on the oak table where his blueprints had been. I explained the concepts, the color theory, the typography, parts of my inner world I rarely shared with anyone. He listened intently, asking smart, insightful questions, his focus making me feel seen in a way I never had before. We talked. For hours. We sat by the fire, but this time there was no chasm between us. I sat curled against his side, his arm draped comfortably around my shoulders, his warmth a constant, reassuring presence. We filled in the blank spaces of each other's lives. He told me about growing up in a small town, about his brief, ill-fated attempt at a corporate job in an architect's firm before realizing he needed to work with his hands. I told him about my own quiet, lonely childhood, about my passion for art that had led me to a career where I could create beauty from behind the safety of a screen. We unspooled our histories, our fears, our small, quiet hopes. With every story shared, the foundation of this new, fragile thing between us grew stronger. The intimacy between us deepened in small, quiet moments. The way he'd brush a stray piece of hair from my forehead. The way I'd find a fresh cup of coffee waiting on the nightstand when I woke up. We learned the rhythms of each other's bodies, the comfort of sleeping next to another person, the simple, profound joy of waking up and seeing his face, relaxed and peaceful in the morning light. One evening, we were sitting on the sofa, reading in comfortable silence. He shifted, trying to get more comfortable, a slight grimace on his face. He stretched his back, letting out a low groan. I looked at him, a slow smile spreading across my face. I lowered my book. "Is it warmer over here?" I asked, my voice soft. He froze for a second, then his eyes met mine. A low, rumbling laugh started deep in his chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness that filled the entire room. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "You're never going to let me live that down, are you?" he said, still chuckling. "Never," I confirmed. He shook his head, his smile wide and genuine. And then, with no tension, no uncertainty, only a comfortable, practiced affection, he moved from his side of the sofa and settled himself into my lap, wrapping his arms around my neck and resting his head on my shoulder. His weight was no longer a shock. It was a comfort, a familiar and welcome pressure. I wrapped my arms around his waist, holding him close, breathing in his scent. This was our callback, our inside joke, a loving reference to the terrifying, wonderful moment that had changed everything. Later that week, when the plows had finally cleared the road, I drove back to my cabin. Not to pack and leave, but just to pick up the rest of my things. As I stood in the small, cold space, it felt like a museum of a life I no longer lived. It was the home of a man who observed from a distance, who built walls to keep the world out. A man who was safe, but profoundly lonely. I looked out the picture window, the one through which I had spent so many hours watching Elias, and I saw him walking from the main house toward me. He wasn't a distant figure anymore. He was real, and he was walking toward me. I stood on the porch of the main house that night, Elias's arm wrapped securely around my shoulders, his warmth a shield against the evening chill. We looked out at the vast, snow-covered landscape, the pine trees dark against the deep indigo of the twilight sky. For so much of my life, I had equated order with safety. My routines, my minimalist apartment, my carefully curated solitude, they were all components of a fortress designed to protect me from the chaos of connection, from the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone in. But I had been wrong. That order wasn't safety. It was just a prettier, more socially acceptable word for loneliness. The storm, the event I would have once seen as a terrifying disruption to my carefully planned life, had been a gift. The chaos I feared so much was the very thing that had shattered my fortress. It had forced me out of my hiding place and into the path of this steady, kind, wonderful man. It turned out the greatest risk wasn't letting someone in. The greatest risk was keeping everyone out and dying of thirst just inches from a well. The warmth of his body next to mine, the solid weight of his arm around me. This was real. This was worth all the chaos in the world.